Hello, everyone, and welcome to another online learning session from New Brain Nutrition and Eat to Be Nice. Today, we're talking about the clinical aspects of hyperactivity, impulsivity, and aggression, and how physical exercise and nutrition may influence these behaviors. We're with Dr. Silke Matura. You'll see her on screen here along with myself, and here we are. Silke Matura is PhD. She's at the Clinic for Psychiatry and Psychosomatics and Psychotherapy at the J.W. Goethe Universität in Frankfurt am Main, Germany. And my name is Jonathan Marks. I'm the Director of Dissemination for New Brain Nutrition and Eat to Be Nice. And with that, I will turn this over to Silke for her presentation, and then we'll come back at the end. So we're going to turn off our cameras now.
So I will talk about classical childhood ADHD manifestations, and we have typical manifestations such as hyperactivity, attention deficit, and aggression. So if we look at the prevalence of ADHD, we see that 5% of children and adolescents worldwide are diagnosed with ADHD, of which most are boys. So boys are much more affected than girls usually. Of these children, 65% carry on having ADHD into adulthood. So it's just 35% of children who don't continue having ADHD when they are adults. So symptoms that are present in childhood don't necessarily express themselves in the same way in adulthood. Like if we look at hyperactivity, this is often expressed as substance abuse in adulthood. Attention deficit, we see that car accidents are much more likely in adults suffering from ADHD than in adults that don't have that condition. So we have conducted a big study here at the University of Frankfurt, and we have seen that the likelihood to be involved in a car accident is very much increased in adults suffering from ADHD. Okay, if we look at aggression, we see that inmates have a much more increased likelihood to suffer from ADHD than the normal population. So aggression is something which is also present in adult ADHD. So ADHD comes with a number of comorbidities. One comorbidity that comes with ADHD is obesity. And we think that the reason for that is that ADHD patients, they tend to eat impulsively, which means that they tend to eat food that has a very high sugar content, that is very rich in fat, and they tend to have very expressed snacking behavior. And with obesity comes hypertension, which is very much present in ADHD. Another comorbidity that comes with ADHD is depression and anxiety. And one reason for that might be that ADHD adults, they have sometimes problems to succeed in their everyday lives. And that increases the likelihood for depression and anxiety. So what can be done with regard to these comorbidities? And we know from many studies that physical activity and diet are effective to treat ADHD symptoms and also the comorbidities.
Very exciting.
Yes. So how can we prevent comorbidities in ADHD? There are some long-term studies that have found a preventive effect of stimulant therapy on the development of depression and obesity in children and adolescents with ADHD. However, there is a problem with non-adherence to medication, typically during adolescence. So this complicates effective treatment and also the prevention of ADHD comorbidities during this risky developmental phase. And we have to look also for alternative or adjunct non-pharmacological interventions to treat and prevent ADHD and its co-occurring symptoms.
And this is really important part of the whole Eat to Be Nice project, is to study non-pharmacological interventions. And we're doing that through studies of nutrition and exercise, as you're going to hear from Silke.
Yes, non-pharmacological interventions are the interventions that we focus on in this project. This is right. So what is the significance of physical activity and diet in the treatment of ADHD? I have to say that the first line treatment remains stimulant medication. So we mostly can't do without medication. But expert consensus has shown that a balanced diet and regular physical activity should be also recommended. So these should be adjunct add-on treatments together with a stimulant medication.
So it's not a replacement, it's an add-on.
Right. It's not a replacement, but it is an add-on. That's absolutely right. So what could be non-pharmacological interventions for the treatment of ADHD? And I've already talked about the importance of physical activity. And here we have a number of activities that are recommended for the treatment of ADHD. And there is aerobic exercise, resistance training, bone strengthening, and flexibility training. And I will go a little bit further into that later on. Regarding the diet, there is a recommendation for the Mediterranean diet, and I will talk a little bit more about that later, and the reduction of fat and sugar intake. Regarding aerobic exercise, this is something which is highly recommended in children and adolescents with ADHD, and it should be really done daily. So every day they should engage in aerobic exercise. It should be moderate to vigorous. And maybe to understand what moderate aerobic exercise means is that you would still be comfortable talking while doing that exercise. When you do vigorous exercise, you don't really want to talk anymore because you're short of breath. So what activities can be done? It's running, brisk walking, swimming, bicycling, soccer, basketball, tennis. So it's really fun activities that can be done and that should be done ideally daily.
And you're also saying here at least 60 minutes or more.
Yes, it should be done as part of a 60 minutes exercise. So you don't necessarily have to swim for 60 minutes, but your exercise should be 60 minutes in total, ideally being mixed between different things, not just aerobic exercise, but also, and I will show you, there should also be resistance training. So ideally, you would mix the different kinds of exercise, not doing just aerobic exercise, but also including resistance training. And which I think is fun about resistance training is that you could just climb a tree, and children love climbing trees. Their parents don't really love when they do it, but climbing trees would be an example of resistance training. And also being on the playground, using the equipment on the playground, climbing up would be some resistance training. And this should be done at least 3 days per week. And also be a part of the exercise that is done, which means you don't really have to climb a tree for 60 minutes, but this is something you should do within the exercise session you have.
And Silke, do we understand why this is beneficial?
Yes, actually, the research hasn't really gone very much into why resistance training is beneficial. The recommendations are also for healthy children. So these are recommendations that have been given by the Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee, and they also apply to healthy children, but it shows that children with ADHD also profit very much from this kind of training. So in order to remain healthy and to act against these comorbidities, this is the kind of training that has been recommended.
Got it.
And then there's also bone strengthening, which is actually part also of aerobic exercise, like running, basketball, tennis, these would be examples also for aerobic exercise, but they also lead to bone strengthening. And this is something which is particularly important in children. Here again, these are recommendations that have been also given to children who do not suffer from ADHD, but also to children and adolescents with ADHD, because it also prevents comorbidities.
Mm-hmm. And do these benefits extend into adulthood? Do we know?
No, we don't know. We don't really know whether children who suffer from ADHD are less likely to continue having this condition in adulthood if they do this exercise. We don't have studies on that yet.
Mm-hmm.
We just know that it ameliorates symptoms in childhood. And I will come to that a little bit later on.
Okay.
So with regard to adults, they also should do aerobic exercise, not as often as children. They don't have to do it daily, but the recommendation is that they should do it 5 days per week. If they do it moderately, thus they can still comfortably talk while doing the exercise, or they should do at least 3 days per week vigorous exercise. So if they exercise vigorously, they don't have to do it as often, or they can combine both, not just doing vigorous exercise, but also moderate exercise. The duration should be between 30 and 60 minutes for moderate exercise, or 20 to 60 minutes of vigorous exercise. And activities would be running, walking, cycling, and swimming. This would be typical examples for aerobic exercise. And if we look at adults with ADHD, we don't really have recommendations so much for resistance training as well, but also for flexibility. So why flexibility? We know these are also recommendations by the Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee. It also helps preventing comorbidities, and it keeps your body in a better shape. And thus you are less likely to develop obesity and also to develop all the symptoms that come with an unhealthy lifestyle. So you should do flexibility training at least 2 to 3 days per week. And the intensity should be as such that you get to a stretch to the point of slight discomfort. So if you do that exercise and you feel slight discomfort, that's just the right intensity.
Can this help with anxiety and depression as well? I would imagine it would.
Yes, this would be counteracting anxiety and depression. And a very good example for flexibility training, and it's very trending these days, is yoga. Mm-hmm. And yoga, it's not just for your body, but also for your mind. And this helps preventing anxiety and also depression. That's absolutely right. And then there's a resistance training for adults. We don't necessarily recommend climbing up trees, but this is something they could do, for example, in a fitness studio, and should also be done 2 to 3 days per week. So ideally, adults could combine some running with some resistance training and also flexibility training. So this could be all in one session. So we say that if you're starting, you should do like 8 to 12 repetitions. If you really want to improve muscular endurance, you should do more repetitions, 15 to 25. So these are the recommendations also for healthy non-ADHD adults, but especially for adults with ADHD. And if we look at the evidence, so why should we do that? Why is this helpful? We don't really have very many control studies on exercise and ADHD, but there are some. And what we see is that there is an improvement of executive functions, which means planning, for example, organizational processes, also attention. And we see that after several weeks, we find an improvement of cognitive and behavioral symptoms. And we also know that exercise, it has a beneficial effect on sleep And we find sleep disturbances very often in children suffering from ADHD. So this helps also sleep. All studies showed an improvement in cognitive functions, but only 1/3 of them actually in behavioral symptoms, for example, aggression. So cognition is always improved, but just 1/3 shows an improvement also in behavioral symptoms.
Silke, are you going to talk a little bit about how these studies are done, or what's going to be happening in the Eat to Be Nice study?
Yes, I can. I will talk about that, about the PROBIA study a little bit later, but I can talk about this now because if we look at adult ADHD, we have very limited data on that. So we don't really know how physical exercise acts in ADHD. And this is something which we want to find out in our Appetite Eat to Be Nice trial. And we don't have an intervention. Thus our participants, we don't tell them to exercise, but they have an accelerometer, sensors that capture their movement behavior. And with that, we know how much they move, and we can draw direct conclusions on how this acts on impulsivity, for example, or also on mood. So we will have more insight into this after we have finished our study.
Wonderful.
And typically, if you have a controlled intervention, how this works is that you have, for example, a sample. Here we have one study with 37 male adult ADHD college students, and the sample was divided due to self-report in low and high activity groups. So this is always a little bit of a problem if you rely on self-report, but this is one of the major studies that have been done. And if you look here, you see that the high activity group scored significantly lower on meter-worry scale and impulsivity scale, and they had less problems with anxious, intrusive thoughts. So yeah, this was really based on self-report, but the persons who did more activity, who exercised more, did very less.
And now this looks like it was a small study. I think the N, it says, equals 10. So is the Eat to Be Nice project or the PROBIA study, is it going to be a larger sample of adults or kids?
Yes, we'll have much larger samples. Like for now, for our PROBIA study, we envision to include 180 patients altogether.
Wow.
So we'll have many more there. And for Appetite, we would like to include even more, like 250 participants. This is the number we would like to include. And luckily, we can include even more. So yes, we'll have much larger N's in our samples, yeah. So I've talked a little bit about exercise. Now I will talk about dietary recommendations. So the dietary recommendations for ADHD, they really focus on unsaturated fat and sugar. So this really should be avoided. And why is that? We know that the intake of fat and sugar increases the risk of obesity, increases the risk of hypertension. And what we now know is that sugar even increases impulsivity. So if the intake is reduced, we can counteract all of these symptoms.
And does sugar include things that are high in calorie that quickly convert to sugar? And I'm thinking of alcohol, for instance.
Yeah, there hasn't been so much research on alcohol, really. There has more high caloric snacks. That's what they have looked into more. It doesn't really have to be sugar, but if you take candies, for example, or if you take cookies, that would be an example of sugary foods. Something which we also call sometimes Western diet, like ice cream, for example. That's the bad news, would have a very high sugar content as well.
Yes.
Fruit can be sugary, but this is not the sugar that we worry. So it's just processed food.
And I think the whole fruit rather than just the juice, right? Because when you take the whole fruit, there's a lot more nutrients to it and pulp that you don't get when you're just drinking juice.
Absolutely. Juice doesn't have to be avoided, absolutely, but it should be mixed with water. So just juice, it's very high in sugar content, and also all kinds of sodas. Let's say all the sugary sodas, and I don't want to say names here, but this should be absolutely avoided because it really heightens impulsivity and it increases the risk of obesity very much. So what do we recommend? There is very much evidence that the omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, they have a lot of beneficiary effects. They reduce the risk of hypertension, and they also reduce hyperactivity and impulsivity. And they can improve attention. And this is something which has been shown in a big meta-analysis by Hawkey and Ushima. So there is much evidence that omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, they can reduce symptoms that come with ADHD. And what is rich in these fatty acids? Olive oil, for example, is rich in these fatty acids, fish, and also nuts. So this is something which really should be included into the diet.
And these are parts of the Mediterranean diet, very common in the Mediterranean diet.
Right. That's something which I just wanted to say now. The Mediterranean diet, it consists of a lot of unsaturated fatty acids and also is very high in vegetables and dietary fiber. So this is the next recommendation that has been shown to be effective. Vegetables and dietary fiber, and every child hates vegetables, almost every child. It's not very easy to include that into the daily diet, but it has beneficiary effects. And what we've seen is that ADHD children, they tend to have vitamin deficiencies, and we can counteract this with the intake of vegetables. So the Mediterranean diet consists of these fatty acids, but also of vegetables. And within Eat to Be Nice, we have some researchers who are part of the PREVALence studies, which has shown that the Mediterranean diet is beneficial for a number of things. It can significantly reduce cardiovascular risk, for example, but it's also good for cognition. So one of the trials we are doing here at Frankfurt is the so-called PROBIA Trial. And what we do is we want to see if probiotics have a beneficial effect on impulsivity. And one of the mechanisms that lies behind that is the gut-brain axis. So we know that the gut microbiome, it can influence our brain and vice versa. So what we do here at Frankfurt is we give to our participants a very potent probiotic, the Symbiotic Forte. And they either receive that probiotic or they receive a placebo. And this is randomized. So it's a double-blind study, so we don't know who receives what. Our participants don't know, we don't know. And after 10 weeks, we capture impulsivity and a number of other psychological traits in order to see if probiotics have induced a change in these traits. Okay, so to finish, I will come to the conclusions and recommendations. So what we know is that physical exercise and a healthy diet have beneficial effects in children, adolescents, and also in adult ADHD. Physical exercise and dietary intervention should only constitute an add-on treatment. They cannot replace medication. First-line treatment remains stimulant medication in ADHD. Physical exercise and diet have varying effects on different symptoms and impairments in ADHD. And it's very recommended that ADHD patients do mixed exercise programs because those might be the most effective for improving cognitive, motor, and behavioral symptoms in ADHD. And to conclude, physical activity and a Mediterranean diet can help to prevent comorbidities such as obesity, hypertension, also anxiety and depression in ADHD patients.
This is all wonderful. This is very, in many ways, prescriptive about what we recommend that people do. Let me, if I can just make a comment and you can add on to that. The reason that we say that medication should be the first line treatment is that medications have what's called a large effect size. They're very effective in terms of their effect on symptoms, whereas diet and exercise have an effect, but it's a lower effect. So we're just saying that you should add on to the medication with good exercise and diet. Is that correct, Silke?
That is absolutely correct. The thing is that if you suffer from a severe case of ADHD, the stimulant medication, it can help you functioning in everyday life. Like if ADHD symptoms are so severe that they prevent you from functioning, the medication would be the first line treatment. If it's just a very, very light case of ADHD, in very few cases, a healthy diet and physical activity might suffice to alleviate symptoms. But I would not recommend them just as a singular treatment for severe, also moderate cases of ADHD. And you always need to consult with a physician.
Right. Good. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is in terms of probiotics, we can recommend people take probiotics, but we need to be careful about dosage, correct? Because we don't want people taking too much.
Yes. We don't want people to take too much because we don't really know how that would affect different symptoms. I think with PROBIA, we're about to find out how it's already quite potent, how this affects different symptoms, but this is a clinical trial, which is very good controlled. So I would say as a course recommendation, if you just eat 1 to 2 yogurts a day, this should suffice.
Right. And then when we get more evidence about what dosages really work, then we can publish that as well.
Right. That's what we are about to do. Yeah.
Good. And so the studies that are going on now, what new information are we going to get from the studies that are going on now?
Yes. I think for the PROBIA study, we will really get more insight on alternative treatments for ADHD. We will get more insight if probiotics are really able to alleviate symptoms of ADHD, if they really can act on impulsivity, because this is certain right now, it's just a guess. We don't really know. And since we're also taking the microbiome, the gut microbiome, all of our participants, they provide fecal samples. So we can also have a look into that. Like we can see how probiotics influence the microbiome and how that in turn influences behavior. And this is something which has not been done in this intensity yet.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Great. Good. So this grant from the EU, which is funding Eat to Be Nice, is really a gift in that we have certain science and scientific knowledge that Silke presented today, but what we're doing is advancing this knowledge with new clinical trials. And what we're doing is sharing our current information with you. And if you stay with us on New Brain Nutrition and Eat to Be Nice, we'll be publishing more information as we get more results from these trials and we learn even more. So we invite you to learn with us and join us in the learning. And Silke, thank you very much for your presentation today. Silke is at the Clinic for Psychiatry and Psychosomatics and Psychotherapy at JW Goethe Universität in Frankfurt am Main in Germany. And my name is Jonathan Marks, the Director of Dissemination for New Brain Nutrition and Eat to Be Nice. Silke, thank you so much.
Thank you too, Jonathan.
We'll talk to you all soon. Stay tuned. Take care.